About a month ago, I did a tiny Ryzen 7 5700G APU build in this InWin Chopin case, and it was awesome. I mean, we overclocked the GPU, we got amazing performance out of the CPU, and ran games pretty decently. But there were 3 real issues that I had with that build. One being that this comes with only a 180 watt power supply, so you can't really push the APU as far as it can go. Second, in terms of cooling, you really don't have much space in here. So we used this tiny Noctua NH-L9A. I mean, it's amazing for its size, but we're talking about a 8-core, 16-thread processor that can easily use 180 watts. So we did see some thermal throttling, and when it was maxed out, this thing can be pretty noisy. And for the final issue, obviously with a case this small, there is no room for expansion and using a graphics card. So we fixed all that. Oh boy. Much better. So this is a Cooler Master NR200 mini ITX case. And yes, it's bigger than the InWin, but it's still pretty small in terms of a desktop PC. And we were able to alleviate all those issues that I mentioned before using this setup. So in here, we have an EVGA 650 watt SFX power supply, 80 plus gold. For cooling, I actually have a 240 millimeter AIO, much better than the tiny Noctua and much quieter. And in terms of expansion, we now have adequate space for a GPU. So all 3 of those things fixed with this build. But did it actually perform any better? So with all this newfound power and cooling potential, that obviously gives us more headroom for more overclocking. So we made some modifications to how we overclocked it. Obviously, we pushed it a little further so we could see if we get more performance. Jumping into the BIOS, you can see we left RAM exactly the same as before, 4000 megahertz at 1.4 volts. But the first major change we made is that we manually overclocked the CPU on all cores. So I messed around with it. I tried to get 4.6 gigahertz all cores on this, but no matter how much voltage I supplied and no matter what settings I tweaked, I couldn't get that stable. So we settled in at 4.5 gigahertz on all cores at 1.41 volts. Moving on to integrated graphics, we could actually push it further with this machine. We're getting 2.45 gigahertz at 1.36 volts on the SoC. So before we could only get, I think, 2.3 gigahertz, so another 150 megahertz just by adding a better power supply. Since we're manually overclocking, I disabled Precision Boost Overdrive. It's not really going to provide much benefit since we are doing everything manual. All right, let's plug this in so you can see the pretty lights. Ooh. That's basically all we did for overclocking. Now, each processor is going to be different. Each motherboard is going to be different. You may get more performance out of yours. You may be able to do it at a lower voltage, but these were the settings that were stable for me and allowed me to get the most performance out of this processor. Let's take a look at the benchmarks. In Cinebench R20, we went from 5481 to 5811. And that's kind of what you can expect when you add better cooling and more power. But if we take a look at the single core run, we actually went down from 580 to 570. Now the reason for that is because before I had just set the CPU to Precision Boost Overdrive and let AMD's algorithms take care of the overclocking. So what Precision Boost Overdrive is good at is allowing single cores to kind of push further than they would if we had an all-core turbo like we do on here. So all these cores are sitting at 4.5 gigahertz and they're not going to be able to go any further. Meanwhile, with Precision Boost Overdrive, we can get up to 4.65 gigahertz if we're running it on a single core. Moving on to Geekbench, it's kind of the same story. Single core, we went from 1597 to 1561, but in multi-core, we went from 9645 to 9778. So again, an increase in multi-threaded performance. When we move on to the graphics test, we actually had a pretty decent performance increase, going from 20,802 to 22,353. Now remember, we're going from, I think, 2.3 gigahertz to 2.45 on the iGPU. Moving on to time spy, we're going to see more of the same, going from an overall score of 1885 to 1982. Increasing nearly 100 points on the graphics score and 200 points on the CPU score. Cool, our benchmarks are better. Tell your friends. But how does gaming change? Do we get any better FPS out of this machine with the improved power and cooling efficiency? Let's run through the games again. League of Legends, obviously easy to run. Before, at 1080p high settings, we were getting over 200 FPS, and with our new system, we were getting over 250 FPS. So both systems performed great on this title. Obviously, it's easy to run, so it doesn't matter. Moving on to CSGO, another esport title that's fairly easy to run. Before, at 1080p medium settings, we were getting 130-ish FPS, and now we were getting over 140, jumping up into nearly 170. So again, great performance on both machines in esport titles. But let's jump into Fortnite, which is a little harder to run, and before at medium settings, we were getting around 110 FPS. And with this machine, while we were still sitting at 110 FPS, we were seeing spikes in some areas into the 130s. So similar-ish performance, but it did feel much smoother playing it on this machine. So in those medium settings, it was essentially rendering at 720p. So we upped that to render at the full 1080p. And before, when we did that, we saw in the lowish 60s. And now we were consistently getting in the high 60s and into the low 70s in most areas. Moving on to Call of Duty, and here's where I saw a more significant increase, and I was pleasantly surprised. So before, we were getting about 43 FPS on 1080p low settings. But in this machine, we were getting in the high 60s fairly consistently. That's a pretty solid performance increase, and honestly, really great performance out of just an APU. And in The Witcher 3, at 720p medium settings, before we were getting about 52-ish average FPS. And with this machine, we were sitting comfortably at 60. Now, in general, all these games just felt like they ran smoother on this machine, and that's got to have something to do with the increased power that we're able to supply to the APU. Like I said, the InWin build performed great, so I didn't really think we'd get a lot more out of this, but what it did help with is the cooling and noise. So right now it's running, and I'm sure you can barely hear it. Like, I have to put my ear next to it to be able to hear the fans, which is so much better than the InWin with that little fan and that much power. Even at idle, the fan was pretty audible. And if you're running any workload or gaming, you basically want to have headphones. But with this, it was awesome. So much better. And I'm a stickler for noise. I would take a performance hit before I'd add more noise to my system. So we have more power, we have better cooling, we have less noise, but how does that translate to thermals and power draw? Now, when I say we have more power, we definitely have more power. At idle, this thing pulls about 54 watts, which is pretty high for a system without a GPU at all. In gaming, we were averaging 174 watts. So if you remember from the last build, the InWin came with a 180 watt power supply. So theoretical max 180 watts, you're not gonna get 180 watts out of it. So right there in gaming, you can see for what we pushed to the processor, we couldn't do that in the InWin build. And now, completely maxed out, we were getting 245 watts from the wall. 245 watts. That's 60 more watts than the InWin power supply can even handle. Now, I don't expect you to ever pull 240 watts from this machine unless you're actively trying to, but still, that's a lot. So how are temps? Well, in gaming, we were sitting comfortably in the high 60s, so zero chance of thermal throttling, barely any noise out of this 244mm AIO. And to push it to the limits, while I was running that stress test to figure out what the max wattage we can pull from it was, I actually ran the CPU stress test and Furmark, pushing the GPU to 100% for 15 minutes. And the highest temperatures we saw were 94 degrees. So yes, that's high, but that is the highest it ever got, and it never thermal throttled. And before in the InWin, a couple of Cinebench runs actually thermal throttled this CPU, and that was with no manual overclocking. So much, much, much better thermal performance out of this. So overall, would I recommend this? Yes and no. Yes, I would 100% recommend going with a build like this over the InWin, unless you just need this small form factor. So yes, I would definitely go with this, but what I would change is the overclocking. Now, when I was messing with this, I was overclocking it for hours, trying to get the most optimal settings, following so many guides. I went in and actually manually adjusted the Precision Boost overdrive settings and tweaked all those, and I still wasn't getting better performance than just manually overclocking the CPU and GPU. So what I would recommend is honestly just setting Precision Boost overdrive to enabled and let it handle the overclocking for you. When I was doing my overclocking testing, I set PBO to automatic and let it do its thing. And I was drawing significantly less power, and my performance was fairly close to what I was getting with the manual overclocking. So that's it. We took our 5700G build and we made it better by making it slightly bigger, giving it more power, and giving it much better cooling. We got a little bit better performance, but our system as a whole is much less noisy. So I'd be interested in the comments. Let me know if you'd go with this or with this. I mean, do you really need your PC to be this small? I mean, this is pretty small too, so let me know which one you'd go with. I know these Ryzen 5000 series APUs are supposed to go on sale in retail relatively soon, so let me know down in the comments if you plan on picking one of those up, and let me know if you can beat some of my benchmarking scores. Subscribe if you like this content. Thanks for watching, and hit that notification bell so you're notified the next time we post something awesome. See you on the next one.